So we're the Digitalization in the Cloud in the 21st Century panel. We don't need to tee up with a lot of details because you've been hearing them from Janeway's discussion about economies becoming more integrated, Larry Smarr talking about big data and throughput. And this team here is really at the core of the vortex, representing a multitude of perspectives. So as we put this in context, digitalization is to commerce what the internet was to the phone. And it's probably one of the most disruptive things to happen, especially to large enterprise, in a very long time. And depending on how you look at digitalization and you carve it, and that's one of the purposes of this panel, the disruption can be very, very massive. We are entering this digital age, and as you probably gathered from some of the panels, it's an age where the shift is from the market inertia being a power asset for a company to perhaps something like he or she who owns the best algorithm wins. And so all of these large companies are going to have to be dealing with this in the next 3 to 5 years, and there'll be winners and losers, et cetera. So this panel, if I can read through, and so they know you, Preston, they know you, Michael, from earlier panels. So Mark, if you could raise your hand, SVP CIO Oracle, James Urquhart, SVP at SOASTA, Tim FitzGerald, VP Digital Transformation Avnet, and Eddie Liongosari, Chief Research Scientist at Accenture. So why don't we go ahead and just dive into the questions for this panel, and then if we have time later, we'll have a Q&A. So why don't we just start by building a foundation. What is digitalization, and why does it matter, especially to the large enterprise? Andy.
So I think the definition of digitalization changes over time. Like back 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, you say, oh, digitalization, well, that means just storing things in digital form that weren't stored this way before. Then today, we are talking about those new products based on that digital content. So I would like to offer an economic definition of digitalization that would not go out of date 5 years from now. So what's really happening is that the cost of storing and sharing and recording information dropped by hundreds of thousands of times over the last decades, or over the last century. It dropped by a lot more than that, of course. So digitalization is the impact, that reduction in the cost of storing and sharing information has on the way we do things. So that's my definition.
Any other thoughts?
I think that's really on. I think the other part of it too is that in addition to the storage part of it, connectivity obviously has gone way, way up as well. So recombination of different forms of measurements. And we have an exploding set of measurements that are happening because it's cheaper and cheaper to store things you couldn't store before. And now you have these recombinations that can happen very rapidly. You have new development techniques, new data analytics techniques, new languages specifically for data analytics and recombination. And I think a big part of what digitization is essentially allowing various processes, independent and sometimes connected, all part of a big system, begin to manipulate how the flows of the data work in addition to the actions taken on the data to find optimizations that work for, right now, human society. But I think part of the conversation is, will that always be the case?
Just to actually, I would just add one more aspect, which is capturing is also getting cheaper. Right? So it's not just about storage. The one thing that you can actually do is, you have a lot of real-time capture, whether it's actually through your mobile phone or through actually your car engine, so forth. There's actually a lot of things that you can capture in real time, and therefore you can respond in real time as well.
So a lot of the customers we deal with view it as the convergence of offline and online. That is, the physical world now has a digital representation and can be manipulated digitally, where before you push the button on your coffee maker. Now it's digitally controlled, and so that merger of the two is a big part of digitalization.
And I think for me, being the CIO guy, it's all about the overall business processes, extending within your enterprise and extending beyond that. So it's the whole integration that we have. It's not just point collection and storing and processing that, but integrating, creating these flows, creating these interactions, enabling these interactions that are interconnected with flows that enable our enterprises to work differently, enable our employees to engage differently, eliminating barriers within our enterprise, eliminating barriers spanning enterprises.
So what about the impact today? So we obviously know that the entertainment industries have been hit by digitalization, the newspaper industry. Now we're seeing, cab, somebody called it e-hire, whatever it is, the industry disrupting the cab industry. Today versus three to 5 years from now, what industries do you see as being impacted?
I don't actually think there's a limit to that. You can take some pretty sleepy industries like the furniture industry, or the agriculture is one of my favorites, because the ability to actually sense whether there's insect activity, the dryness, this is big in California, using information on the dryness, you can actually cut the water use in half, pretty big deal when you use a gallon per almond that's produced. And fertilizers as well. That is, you can start targeting, and I think we're going to see what amounts to micro-targeting, that is personalized plans that respond to the data in every single industry. There won't be any exceptions to that.
Any other comments? How about winners and losers in terms of this new world of digitalization? The slow-moving versus a...
Well, you're going to have a lot of new business models. And so a lot of the existing companies are going to be upended in this. From the earlier panel where we saw networks where ADAX, the people who actually make the physical goods, I think we're going to see a lot of that. That is just this new markets, new intermediations, new technologies for tracking, completely new logistics. And as a result, you're going to see lots of new empires. I like to say Uber and Airbnb are only the first of what is going to be a tsunami.
So, some of the pitfalls, I think, include we can't be Uberized. I mean, you have to look at much, much broader than that. Another pitfall is to think of digitalization as a technology as opposed to a business, and treating it from a business perspective. And then, I see another pitfall that I run into meeting with our customers is when they've carved it off and created their chief digital officer or created the organizations as opposed to making it integrated right through the entire enterprise.
And just in terms of 3 to 5 years from now, I think one of the big things that comes out of this is really with the recombination of data that occurs. I think there's a whole new generation of companies that are simply real-time insight, ongoing insight into some area of focus, and they can be everything from entertainment to medical, to to industry tracking. I mean, if you're an industry analyst right now, you better be thinking about digitizing. And I think really a big part of it to me is, we can't know where this evolution is going to go. We can't predict solidly specific companies that'll be winners or specific elements that'll be winners. But that the shift is happening, and you should be evolving as a part of the game. And I think that's the key part of it.
Yeah, it seems to me all of us on the panel represent technology companies, and technology is a huge component of it. We've also talked about operational processes and how the application of those new technologies are really driving the need to reevaluate how businesses operate in general. The huge impact that culture plays in being able to do that work with speed, and the implied impact of needing to listen to your customers at a level that you probably never have before, I think is huge. So from my vantage point, the winners and the losers are going to be all about speed of execution in this new world of doing business and the application of all of those digital impacts across the entire enterprise.
Just one more thing to add, which is, I think it's like sort of obvious to all the conversation that we have, but just want to call it out, which is the information's available. Which is, how you're going to be able to capture, how you're going to be able to restore, how much actually the companies know about their customers and how actually to interact with them and how to make an effective use of it, whether it is about creating their own services or even actually build a whole new ecosystem with their partners to actually better serve you. I think that is actually sort of very core to what actually you can do there.
There's been a lot of conversation about analytics, and from my vantage point, there's an explosion of available data. But being able to pour through that data to draw insights and turn it into actionable information in a meaningful way without getting too overwhelmed by the explosion of data, I think is a huge competitive advantage for where this all goes to.
Algorithms versus inertia. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, just real quick, too, just to throw something out from yesterday's talk, too, right? I wonder if there's a business in stocks and a business in being a buffer between very, very high rates of flow and bad decisions, right?
Then when we talk about it, in the makeup of the Fortune 500, I think you guys have all interacted with these companies. How well prepared are they for this digitalization, cloud computing era that's hitting us?
Well, a great example is what's happening with General Electric. Jeff Immelt went to sleep one day running an industrial manufacturing company, woke up the next morning running a software company. And their commercials were the most popular commercials throughout the Olympics. But we're seeing that increasingly as companies are either going to be washed out by this wave or going to ride the wave and to really a new level of success. So I think some are really adapting well. They're taking advantage of what the technology has to offer. They're leveraging cloud computing to allow them to fail fast, allow them to try more things, allow them to scale more elastically. So I'm quite excited about a lot of things that I'm seeing. But on the other hand, you see some slow movers, and I think they are going to be casualties much quicker than we've ever seen before as well.
I think it's actually easy to overestimate just how dramatic these changes will be. If you look at the 1950s and the forecasts, where are our flying cars today? I do think there are going to be some pretty dramatic changes, but a lot of those things are in some sense not delivering, they're personalizing rather than meeting the basic needs. In medicine, the personalization may save a lot of lives, and that could be very huge. But I do think it's actually, how much different is your life going to be relative to it is today? May not be. We may be overestimating just how big those changes will be, at least on the consumer space.
Well, you're on tape, so on video, so we all are. So what about when we talk about cloud compute? Oh, Eddie, did you have?
No, I just want to actually show. So just mention the statistics that I think is actually pretty common, which is the, if you look at S&P 500, if you actually sort of pull it back in history, 1960s, average companies in that list is about 60 years. But if you actually sort of fast forward right now, it's about 15 years, and by 2020 it's only 12 years. So there's a big turnover in terms of the companies actually sitting on the top there.
So when, and I promised last year that would be the last cloud computing panel, at least to Mark and stuff, and so we've pretty much focused on digitalization, but we do have kind of the role of cloud computing in enabling all of this, right? So in terms of, the agility and other things, the other thing that, and I want to ask you about is, we heard some security discussions today, right? So now we have big data sets, and we're talking about more and more devices accessing those data sets in the Internet of Things. We seem to be also creating a lot of attack surfaces that may or may not have access to data in some form or other storage. What are your thoughts about that, and then other things like machine learning and analytics? That's a big, meaty question. Open up some dialogue about kind of what are the things taking shape in the guts of IT that are allowing this to happen or may be impediments?
Well, I'll take a first stab. One of the things that cloud computing allows is collaborative filtering. That is, I can train a model based on hundreds of millions of people's behavior and then personalize it to you. So I can have a very large model that lives in the cloud that you could never run on your phone, but then I can push it out the piece of that model to your phone that's relevant to you. And I think we're going to see that in almost every aspect of our lives. So that's a really huge change and something that just you couldn't imagine doing that without cloud computing. And that's the whole, you need the mobile connections, you need the cheap sensors, and you need the machine learning, which itself is a technology that's been improving by leaps and bounds over the last decade. That's often kind of left off the list with cloud computing, but the ability of machine learning to do voice translation, to detect what's in images, to decode what's in video in real time, all of those things fell to deep neural nets, where they failed to fall to every earlier machine learning technology. So I think those are really quite dramatic changes in application, and I think this, we have a lot of computing power on our person. I think where the cloud comes in is on the 500 million person computing. You've still got a lot of computing power locally, and it's better not to go through the airwaves for that, given that that's become really cheap too.
One of the things I'm really excited about with machine learning is having it baked into our applications. HCM, human capital management, that actually leveraging machine learning to say, who's the best candidate? In your ERP, what's the optimal payment terms? I mean, the opportunity to not have to have real experts in artificial intelligence and machine learning, but it's just baked into the applications that are used across an organization, I think is going to drive tremendous value.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah, oh, you bet.
So one of the things that's going to be a dramatic change over the next 5 to 10 years is the ability for enterprise systems to say, you need to have lunch with this other person, and here's the topic you're going to talk about. But I mean, how many times have you just met someone at a retreat that turned out to be really important for you to meet, and it was just totally serendipity? We now have enough data about humans inside enterprises through their email and through their calendar and so on to actually say proactively, here's who you don't know that you need to know. This is the person who can help enable what you're working on. Or for that matter, we want to produce a team to work on something. Who are the best 7 people to work on that are actually available? All of that technology is in alpha form at this point. I mean, that is to say, it's being tested by a variety of companies and will be coming out. And I like to frame this as Oracle and SAP helped us understand what the physical assets of our enterprises were and what the tax consequences of any changes we wanted to make to those physical assets. But they gave us very little insight into our human assets. Well, human assets are more than double the value of physical assets within the company. That's not counting IP. That's that and goodwill are the remaining categories. And so this ability to do what Oracle and SAP did for physical assets with human insight, with human assets, is going to be just absolutely transformative to the way companies work.
I wanted to get to the security thing just slightly, and I think some other comments, but really quickly, I mean, one of the big problems here, though, is as this data moves through the flows, is understanding whether it's authentic, where it came from, how much you can trust it, and what you can do with it. The term data provenance, I think, will become increasingly large, increasingly huge. I think the role of blockchain shows promise in that space, tremendous promise. I was just looking, there's a group I didn't know about that I just found today called provenance.org that is tracking sustainably grown tuna from harvests to retail delivery. And those kinds of concepts, bringing that to data, bringing that to physical assets, bringing that to human assets, potentially. I think that to me is really critical to make this work in a way that people can trust it without having to trust a third party in the middle of it all.
So digital trust brands, right? At the end of the day, they're...
Well, and it was the same thing we had with cloud, right? You and I had these conversations about what cloud needed to be successful was trust.
Yeah.
Back in the day, and that's where we are with digitization and the representation of people, especially as digital entities, but even possessions. We have to get to a point of trust.
So I know you guys are waiting for our favorite question here. So we have about 8 minutes left, and it is, so as we look forward 3 to 5 years, this is an open flow, free flow discussion, tribute to Mark there. What do we see as, or what do you see as the biggest surprise that will play itself out, the most non-intuitive events that will happen or things that will happen, those surprises?
Well, so first I think the future is always very much like the past, but much longer. So to answer this question, as a good statistician, I'd like to look back 3 to 5 years ago and see what the biggest surprises were. And the answer is, well, actually there were none. So my prediction is 3 to 5 years from now, there would actually not be any major surprises. Things would develop more or less as we expect. So this being said, looking back 3 to 5 years, what is the biggest surprise? Even though there's not a huge surprise, there must be something that's the biggest surprise. So for me personally, the biggest surprise of the last 3-5 years is the Bitcoin. It's something that who might have imagined it would be relatively big. And Bitcoin is also kind of pretty unimportant for pretty much anything. So I anticipate that the biggest surprise of 3 to 5 years would be like a Bitcoin, something that comes out of the left field, totally surprises us, and is quite unimportant.
I would say Waze, Airbnb, and Uber are all pretty big surprises, at least for their industries.
Oh, I wouldn't call
well, for you,
surprises.
Yeah, Waze is not a surprise for you, I get that, but yeah, anything?
So I think some things are surprising to some people and not to others.
Yeah,
and
that's
so
true.
I'm going to give one that there will be some people who aren't surprised at all, but there will be others, I think, who aren't thinking about it in these terms. So there have been 5 enormous waves of mergers in U.S. history. And I think we're about, and all of those had a technological foundation. That is to say, there was a technological change or set of technological changes that basically mandated that companies change. And the way they changed was often through mergers and acquisitions. So I think we're going to see, in fact, I think it's already started. I think it started in 2014, a wave of IoT, cloud, software eating the world-based mergers. And I think this is arguably going to be much larger than, well, the 1980s merger that was sort of, regulation technology changes, the opening of the airlines and so on. That was a pretty big wave. I think this one will be as big as that, if not bigger. But it's all about the use of data, mobile computing, and so on. And just to give a couple of statistics, it's much better to be the acquired than the acquirer. It's better to be a firm in a country that has high accounting standards than a country with low accounting standards. So as much as we all bitch and moan about SOX, it's actually advantageous for merger profitability. And then finally, the earlier you are in the wave, the more profitable the merger. And so those are 3 things that argue for act now. And that's seeing that it's coming. I don't know how surprising it is, but
It's good points, yeah.
And a couple of technologies that I think are going to be ubiquitous at the end of this decade is thought to text. Already there's some crude headsets that you can wear that if you concentrate, you can do it, but I think it's just going to be ubiquitous and the profound impact that they may have. And then something else, earlier this week, I have a middle schooler and he was preparing for history and they were talking about nationalism, and it's people that are geographically close, people who are united by religion, but people who are united by language. And also that separated by language. And so I think by the end of this decade, they'll be universal. I mean, all of us will have it. Voice translation that not only will translate real time so we can have a conversation, but it's in your voice. So I think those 2 technologies, thought to text as well as universal translation, are going to have a profound impact.
From my side, it's actually less of a surprise, but I think it's actually sort of future concern. So one of the things that, I work with industrial IoT, and there's actually a lot of port scanning technology out there. And one thing that I actually found out is that there are at least 60,000 open ports in the US alone that is actually have industrial protocols running on it, okay? And this is all open port. And you can actually see those sort of this, they're just waiting to be attacked at any particular time. So I'm just calling out to anybody who actually have any, supervision on those industrial ports, because if there's like something big, some attack, it is not about loss of IP, it's about loss of life.
Of course, the biggest surprise in the last 3 to 5 years has to be Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Right, now I got to follow that.
Yeah.
No, I think one of the biggest things too is the way that companies are organized as they go digital. There's a concept called Conway's Law, attributed to Murray Conway, a mathematician, that basically says that the systems that are developed by an organization will reflect the communication structures within that organization. And as we've had human communication structures largely to date, these systems that we build largely represent the projects that have been started to build this component or this component, and how those communications happen together reflect a lot about how the people communicated to each other as they set up these projects and define these projects. As we allow these digital connections to evolve more quickly and introduce machine learning to make some of these decisions about how to connect the dots within an organization, more and more the flows are going to dictate themselves. You're going to see advantageous opportunity to go connect these things together. How quickly can we do that? I'm going to self-service, go grab your data and make that happen. When that happens, my belief is within 3 to 5 years, you're going to see more and more organizations declaring that they're organizing around the digital system, that they're changing their human organizations to reflect what the digital systems are set up to do and how they're advantageous.
It makes me think about, and not necessarily a prediction, but something that I'm spending a little bit of time paying attention to, with the speed of learning and how digital technologies are really accelerating that. I wonder how crowdsourcing talent, particularly specialized talent, will play a much bigger role in affecting the disruption. So this notion of, does it have to be a W-2 employee to manage the IP within the company, or are we going to see a greater proliferation of people that are contract labor across multiple industries?
Yeah, it's a great point.
Just to add on to that, I think this is actually really interesting. I think this actually comes from digitization, automation, and then, of course, the question is actually what happened to the employees, right, the workers and so forth. I think that's actually where we're going to end up with actually a lot of employees actually going out, actually working with multiple employers, if you will, right, actually sort of take advantage of their core competence, not just at one particular organization, but multiple organizations, and to be able to share the wealth that way.
So we are out of time, and I don't want to get the hook. So if you have any questions for us, if you want to run into us later after this panel, it'd be great. Look forward to it. So thank you, guys. Thank you.